All right, folks, both my phones show that it is 1 o'clock. So we're going to get things underway, and I would just say good afternoon. And I want to thank everybody for joining us here today. My name is Rick Lear, and I am the ANJEE treasurer. And also with us today is Erin Rounds. She is the co-president of ANJEE as well. And today we're excited to kick off our 38th annual conference with our first workshop, which is called Botanical Literacy, Battling Plant Blindness in a Changing Climate. And this is all part of ANJEE's 38th annual winter conference. Before we get started, I certainly want to take a moment to give a special thank you to our conference sponsors, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We have a sponsorship from an anonymous donor who's a friend of science and environmental education in New Jersey, and the Institute for Natural History Arts. We'd also like to thank our keynote sponsor, Najarian Associates, our award sponsor, Duke Farms, and BASF for supporting our field experiences. A couple notes: we are placing the link to our YouTube channel in the chat room, where you can see all of our recorded content from past conferences, forums, and other sponsored events. We hope you subscribe to ANJEE's YouTube channel, so that'll be in the chat. A few reminders for the session. We ask that everyone keep themselves on mute throughout the presentation to eliminate background noise. If you do have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat room. Erin will be monitoring the chat room so that at the end of the presentation, we can kind of get those questions addressed. And there will also be a time for live questions towards the end of the presentation, in which during that time, you can either raise your hand on the video, or you can use the raised hand icon so that we can get all those questions and or comments answered. So we're very happy to be joined today by Eva Popp from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. She is our presenter today. And during this session, we will all learn about plant blindness and the problem it poses for our changing climate. Get a sneak peek at the NJDEP's new botanical literacy curriculum that is based on the NJSLS learning goals for grades K through 12. Discover activities designed to inspire stewardship and support understanding of the botanical world while fulfilling students' developmental needs. So without further ado, Eva, I'll let you introduce yourself, take over the screen, and let's get started.
Thank you so much, Rick. I'll go ahead and share my screen now. Okay. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and choosing to attend my session. I also want to thank Rick and Erin for helping to facilitate this whole thing, and to thank the conference administrators for allowing me the opportunity to present. So like Rick said, I'm Eva, and today I'm here to represent the NJDEP. My background educationally is in ecology. I got a degree from Rutgers, and I've also been working in informal environmental education for about 3 years now. And like Rick said, today I'm here to talk to you about the importance of botanical literacy and battling plant blindness in the context of our changing climate. So before we get started, I want to start with a little brain exercise. So quick, just off the top of your head, think, what is this a picture of? I'm sure many of you would say that this is a picture of monkeys, and you'd be entirely correct in that answer, but you'd also be missing a big part of what the artist chose to depict in this painting. We can see we have a wide variety here of all different kinds of grasses, flowers, trees, shrubs, but for some reason, our brain keys in on the animals, the monkeys, as being the focal point of this image. And this illustrates a concept known as plant blindness. The term plant blindness was first coined by researchers Wandersee and Schussler in 1999, and their definition involves two parts, a cognitive component and a cultural component. So cognitively, we see that we as humans tend to fail to notice plants in our surrounding environment, and they just kind of fade into the background, like we can see depicted in this illustration. There's also a cultural component to plant blindness, where we tend to undervalue the importance of plants in our everyday life. And this bias is so powerful, it is considered the default human condition by these researchers. So first, let's unpack the first half of that definition, the cognitive component. We can think about the ways that the characteristics of plants interact with the way that our brain processes data. So first, thinking about plants, we know that they tend to exist either above or below our line of sight, like we see in these two images on the slide. And then also depicted in these two images is plants' tendency to lack edges. They're very similar in color, and their forms can sometimes overlap one another, and they just tend to appear and blend together as one green mass. Plants are also unthreatening to humans, and they lack movement that exists on a scale that is observable to humans. So now moving over to the other half of the slide, thinking about how our brain actually processes cognitive data. So in order to be as efficient as possible, our brain does something called chunking, where it will take in this visual information and then group similar information together in a chunk. And that chunk is processed by our brain in one go. So if our brain is taking in information of plants and creating that chunk and labeling it as plants, we know that because plants are unthreatening to humans, our brain considers that information unimportant, and it is simply discarded and doesn't really ever even enter our working memory or attention. And so these characteristics of plants, combined with the way that our brain processes visual data, creates what's known as an inattentional blindness of plants. So now let's address the other half of that definition, the cultural component. This idea of plant neglect and a lack of quality botanical education have been written about since the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And most of the time, this is attributed to the idea of zoocentrism, which is the idea that we as humans, we are animals, and so we tend to view animals as being more important, more interesting, more complex, and therefore more worthy of study than plants. I was really interested to find out that in the early 1900s, virtually all high schoolers took a botany class as part of their standard high school curriculum. But by the time the mid-1900s rolled around, those separate botany and zoology classes were combined into one general biology class. And because of zoocentrism, most of those biology teachers tended to specialize in zoology, which led to generations of zoocentric biology education, and then went on to reinforce that inattentional blindness, which leads us to where we are today. And these cognitive and cultural components of plant blindness, they don't act alone. They actually act as a positive feedback loop and reinforce one another. So we see that our lack of attention, interest, and knowledge of plants actually furthers our animal-centric biology education and the lack of plant representation in the media, which then again goes on to further our lack of attention, interest, and knowledge of plants. But why is this so important? Why did I choose to talk to you about plant blindness today? Well, the botanical knowledge and expertise that is held by government officials, leaders in business, and educators ultimately goes on to influence the management of our country's land and resources. And considering the climate challenges we'll be facing in the 21st century, we have an urgent need for quality botanical education. And over the course of my research, one thing kept coming up over and over again as the most powerful investment in climate resilience, and that is environmental education. So today, I want to introduce to you the idea of botanical literacy for climate resiliency. And we define botanical literacy as the interest, knowledge, skills, and curiosity to observe, question, and investigate the botanical world. Botanical literacy is so important because plants are foundational in the environment. They comprise a majority of the biodiversity on our planet, and they're also the source of all primary productivity on Earth, which means that all the energy present in all trophic levels of all ecosystems on Earth has come from plants at some point. Plants are also vital to humanity, both in terms of the ecosystem services that they perform and the food, medicine, textiles, building materials, and other commercial goods that they provide. Looking towards the future, we see that plants are a source of climate solutions. Through botanical science, we'll find ways to create a more sustainable food system or create bioengineered crop varieties that are resistant to disease, pests, and weather changes. We can also see plant-based materials begin to replace plastics and biofuels and other renewable energies replacing fossil fuels. We can also see plants provide solutions to directly mitigate impacts of climate change. So we see this dune grass planting is helping to mitigate sea level rise and manage flooding and storm surge. Plants are also vulnerable to climate challenges. I'm sure all of you are familiar from the past few summers with invasive species, and not only how much of a nuisance they can be, but also how much of a threat they are to our economy and our food system. And of course, in New Jersey, biodiversity loss is also a big threat when we consider the urbanization of our state. And plants are also vulnerable to direct impacts of climate change, namely climate warming. So with plant migration, we see that plant communities that are adapted to living within a certain temperature range, as the climate warms, these communities will be forced to move to higher altitudes. And the animals that depend on those plant communities will follow suit. As a result of climate warming, we can also see phenology shifts, which can lead to ecological mismatches. So as it gets warmer every year, as the average temperature is rising, we'll actually see spring becoming earlier every year, and trees will be leafing out and flowers blooming earlier every year. And of course, any insects that feed on those trees, their hatching will coincide with that time of leaf out. But for example, if we have a migratory bird species that feeds on a caterpillar species, for example, as that caterpillar is hatching earlier and earlier every year, those migratory birds are still arriving from their migration at the same time. And eventually, as this temporal disparity becomes greater and greater, we may see that by the time these birds arrive from their migration, these caterpillars have already metamorphosed and completely left these birds without any food source. And I'm sure you can all imagine the cascade effect that we would see throughout the food web as a result of this. New Jersey faces some of the most significant climate challenges. We have the highest rate of sea level rise and climate warming of all states in the country. And we also have the highest urban population and the second highest amount of urban land cover. Luckily, we as a state are rising to meet those climate challenges. I'm sure many of you as educators are familiar with the new 2020 New Jersey Student Learning Standards. And these learning standards actually set a national precedent in environmental education by making New Jersey the first state to require climate change instruction at all grade levels. So in order to ensure this environmental education contains quality botanical content, my team and I have decided to create the New Jersey Botanical Literacy Curriculum. We've been working on researching and creating this curriculum for the past year. It's still currently under development, but we hope to be ready to distribute and implement it by late summer, early fall of this year. So these are 3 of the objectives that we defined for our curriculum. The first being to incorporate instruction on the value of plants into public school of New Jersey at all grade levels. And in order to do this, we'll be creating and distributing comprehensive lesson planning materials that are based on the NJSLS. And through doing so, we'll be preparing students as informed citizens and ready to be global leaders to lead innovation in the climate crisis. But first, I want to kind of translate these objectives into something that is a little bit more workable for us and in simpler terms. So of course, if we're going to create lesson plans that are based on the NJSLS, we first have to understand these new climate-based learning standards. So here we can see an overview generally of some examples of climate-based learning standards that we can find in the NJSLS. And we see with lower elementary, most of these learning standards involve identifying climate solutions. In upper elementary, students are synthesizing information from multiple sources and comparing solutions. In middle school, students move on to actually designing their own solutions. And by the time they're in high school, students are acting as climate scientists themselves, analyzing data to create models and make predictions about future climate impacts. And of course, this comprises a very nice and academically rigorous program to introduce climate change. But there's more to climate education than just academics. We want to ensure that we're also instilling in our students a desire for environmental stewardship. And I'm sure we can all agree that even as adults, climate change is a really difficult subject to talk about. It's emotionally difficult to discuss because it forces us to confront uncertainties about the future, and then also to confront our own powerlessness in controlling those uncertainties. It's also cognitively complex to talk about because it involves these conceptually complex issues on a global scale with multiple different stakeholders and systemic problems. And when we think about having these conversations with children, it becomes even more complicated because we have to consider their cognition. Young children are still working on forming their idea of reality. They're still working to understand the way that the world works and what is even possible in reality. And a great example of that is seen in their tendency to think egocentrically. And the best way to describe this egocentric thinking is using child psychologist Jean Piaget's experiment called the mountain task. So in this experiment, we see the child subject is allowed to walk around and look at this mountain table from all sides, from all angles. And then the child is sat back in his chair and he's asked, "What do you see?" And the child says, "I see a red ball." Then the child is asked, "What does the doll see?" And without fail, children under a certain age will always respond, "The doll sees a red ball." Because at this age, their egocentric thinking is preventing them from considering the viewpoints of others. And children this young are unaware that others even have viewpoints, feelings, and desires that can be different from their own. So when we think about this egocentric mindset that young children are in, when we present them with information that can be potentially distressing, it can have long-lasting impacts. So thinking about children's tendency to think egocentrically, when we present them with information about negative climate impacts, this leads them to view these negative impacts through a personalized lens. So anything that they hear about on the news or in school, they immediately relate it back to themselves because that's how they view the world. And these negative climate and environmental impacts can feel very, very real to them and feel like it can happen to them and their family. And of course, when you're a young child and you feel like your town or your home is at risk of wildfires or flooding, that is extremely distressing. And that leads to feelings of anxiety and discomfort. And over time, as this pattern is reinforced in their brains, these feelings of anxiety can actually subconsciously lead to avoidance. It almost acts like a trauma, and it makes the child subconsciously want to avoid any association with these environmental impacts or the environment in general. So as educators, we have a responsibility to ensure that our students are cognitively and emotionally prepared for the climate change instruction that we'll be presenting to them. And the first step of that is utilizing developmentally appropriate climate instruction. So again, revisiting our friend Jean Piaget, the child psychologist, we can see that he's defined 4 stages of childhood cognitive development. And these stages correspond to the way that children view and interact with the world. And these stages were actually taken and applied to environmental education. So we see David Sobel, who's a well-known environmental education author. He uses these stages to kind of act like a framework and help guide climate-based environmental education. So youngest children from 3 to 7 years old, Piaget terms them as being in their pre-operational stage. And this is characterized by that egocentric thinking that we discussed, and then also an inability for logical reasoning. Sobel defines children in their pre-operational stage as being in an empathy phase. So the most effective instruction for children at this age is empathy-based. And one of the best ways to do this is allow children to become whatever you're learning about, instead of objectifying your learning material. At this age, it's also really important to cultivate that connection to nature with children, and also help to foster a sense of wonder in them, and really just get them excited about observing and participating in the natural world. In the context of climate education, it's important for this age that any discussion or activities are centered around children's existing ideas of negative climate impacts. It's not really necessary to introduce any new information at this point. If children do bring up climate impacts and that might be potentially distressing, it's important that you acknowledge the truth in the point that they brought up, but then also to offer solutions. For children 8 to 11 years old, they're now in their concrete operational phase. So they're no longer thinking egocentrically, and they are capable of logical reasoning, but to an extent. That logical reasoning has to happen using observable and tangible examples. And now, thinking about Sobel, how Sobel has defined children in this age range, they are in their exploration phase. So kind of thinking about how rapidly their world is expanding. First, really, their whole world is just maybe their house and their backyard. And then it expands to their school, and maybe some parks around their town, and then friends' houses, and then woods by their house, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And as their landscape is rapidly expanding, they have a desire to explore this landscape. And this exploration helps them to develop their sense of place and develop a connection to their local landscape, which helps to build a sense of environmental stewardship for later on. When introducing climate content for children in this age, it's important to provide them with examples that are observable and personally relevant to them, and ideally should be taking place in their local landscape. Not only to fulfill their desire to explore, but also because they're not yet capable of this logical reasoning without observable examples. So now moving on to adolescence. Children 12 years old and older are defined by Piaget as being in their formal operational stage. So at this point, they are capable of abstract reasoning and hypothetical thought. And thinking about their developmental needs in terms of environmental education, David Sobel characterizes this as a social action phase. So as children begin to discover their new adolescent identity, they desire to develop a connection to society and kind of figure out where they fit in their community. And then also, as they're starting on this transition to adulthood, they're beginning to want to take on more social responsibility and start practicing filling that adult role. So at this age, it's a great idea to begin introducing service learning initiatives. So projects within the school or community outreach projects. And then at this age, it's also now finally appropriate to address those more conceptually complex and potentially emotionally distressing ideas of climate change. And then also to address ideas that are taking place on not just an observable local scale, but a more regional, national, or possibly global scale. It's also important to note that children will still benefit from instruction that is based in younger stages. So, for example, a 14-year-old fully in their social action phase still benefits from empathy-based and exploration-based instruction. And that actually helps them and supports them in their desire for social action. And in the same way, a 5-year-old can still participate in social action activities, but you need to ensure that these activities are scaled down to be appropriate for their development. So in addition to providing that developmentally appropriate instruction, we also have to think about supporting our students' emotional climate literacy. Just like we want to give them tools and skills for scientific literacy, we need to give them tools and skills for emotional literacy. We are tasking these students with a huge responsibility. We're basically expecting them to solve climate change. And this can be extremely overwhelming and anxiety-provoking for students. So we need to give them the tools to deal with those emotions. And one of the ways that you can incorporate this is through holding climate conversations with your students. And these should be very open and casual discussions, just allowing your students to share their feelings about climate change, and then also identify with and connect with the feelings of their peers. Children should also be given individual opportunities to self-reflect on their climate thoughts, and then to identify and process any feelings that may arise as a result of those thoughts. And we as educators, it's also really important for us to consider our own emotional climate literacy, because just like our students have a really big job, we have a really big job as well, because we have to prepare them to basically solve climate change. And this can be emotionally distressing and overwhelming for us as well. So it's important that as teachers, we are filling our own emotional climate literacy cups before we're expected to fill those of our students. Luckily, we see that providing students opportunities to build empathy with nature helps to support both developmentally appropriate climate instruction and their emotional climate literacy. So we want to help them to build their environmental empathy alongside building their climate knowledge. And I find the best way to do this is allowing children to have direct interaction with the natural world. Hands-on activities where they're out there in nature. And this doesn't have to be structured like a class. This can be simply unstructured and simple exploration. As students get a little bit older, it's also appropriate for them to begin to participate in solutions. so they can realize their own agency to enact positive environmental change. And luckily, we see that some of the ways to help students build empathy with the environment are also some of the best ways to spark botanical interest and curiosity. And as educators, we're in a really advantageous position because we have the power to hijack the cycle of plant blindness. So simply through incorporating more botanical content in our education, we can actually stop this positive feedback loop or use this positive feedback loop to our advantage and promote more plant interest and knowledge, which will then again go on to support more cultural plant awareness. Of course, like developing any interest or skill, it's best if you start young in childhood. And again, this doesn't have to be very structured interaction with nature, like a class or anything. It can just be allowing a child to explore the outdoor world or maybe to practice gardening alongside a parent. And this brings us into our next way to promote plant interest, which is the presence of a plant mentor. And again, this doesn't have to be anything official like a teacher or other professional. This is simply a person who models behavior of appreciating, observing, and caring for plants. And of course, just like with building empathy, hands-on experience is the best way to get kids interested in plants. With my experience as an educator, my favorite way to do this is through sensory interaction. And with plants, they provide us with all different kinds of different smells to discover. So for example, in the bottom center photo, we have the ailanthus tree, which is also an attractant of spotted lanternflies. So we can see obviously that this plant is very interesting to gather around and observe. But also when you crush the leaves, it has a kind of stinky smell like rotten peanut butter, it's described as. And this kind of has that gross out factor that's really exciting to kids. In the bottom right picture, we see kids picking jewelweed flowers. And after these flowers mature, their seed pods actually explode when you touch them. So that's a very fun thing to show as well. It's a fun surprise. And then for older children, personal relevance to plants is a great way to get them interested. And I find that children are really delighted by discovering that a wild plant that they see on the side of the road all the time is actually edible, like these wineberries. Or that plants can be used to make something useful. So like we can weave these iris leaves into a shoe, or maybe another plant can be made into a tool with useful applications. So now that we've learned a little bit more about what these climate-based these climate-based learning standards look like, we know a little bit more too about how to introduce developmentally appropriate climate instruction and support our students' climate literacy. And then we also know about how to help promote plant interest. We want to kind of bundle up all of those elements and find a teaching philosophy that can cleanly deliver them. And I was very lucky to discover this philosophy, not through research on the internet, but actually through living it myself as a teacher at a nature school. So I have had experience in environmental education for a few years now, but although we did have outdoor components of it, it was all largely indoor based. So this experience was very different for me because I was teaching a preschool class fully outdoors, rain or shine, every day we're out there. And just like any other preschool program, children are learning their ABCs and numbers, but doing it outside with nature as our learning tool. So here are some of the key elements that I've defined from our nature school philosophy. And of course, the most important thing is outdoor learning. And again, this involves or this allows for those hands-on experiences that are so important for building empathy and interest. And also, because our classroom is the forest, there's always something new to observe every day. And of course, this leads us to ask questions about these observations. So in the bottom right-hand photo, we can ask the question, what happened to this acorn? And we can follow this line of inquiry, and sometimes that one question inspires our entire lesson for the day. So this is a great example of child-led learning. And we also see learning through play as a great way of child-led learning. So although this child may think he's simply building a rock tower, he is actually learning about physics and balance. He's learning about natural consequences, and he's also developing his fine motor skills. Safe and healthy risk-taking is also a key element of nature school philosophy. And for some kids, that looks like the photo on the left. For other kids, it looks like the photo on the right. But this really involves giving children the power to make the call and make their own personal decision about if a situation is safe for them while they are in the presence of a supportive adult. So then later on down the line, when a child or a teenager is on their own, they feel they have the confidence to make the call about whether a situation is safe for them without relying on an adult to make that call for them. So I wanted to kind of capture the essence of nature school philosophy and be able to translate it into our botanical literacy curriculum. But as you can see here, it wasn't exactly a one-for-one translation with these elements. We see the nature school elements on the left and the botanical literacy elements on the right. So of course, I wanted to incorporate the outdoor classroom, but this doesn't have to involve elaborate field trips every week. This can simply be 15, 20-minute trips around the schoolyard or around your neighborhood, around the school. And even if outdoor access isn't realistic for your classroom, you can still bring the outdoor classroom inside by incorporating plants and other natural materials into your instruction. And then of course too, we want to maintain this hands-on learning through experiences because it allows for child-led or student-led learning, and students are asking questions about their observations, and then they're actually learning to answer their own questions. And we can see I've translated our practical skill building element of nature school into our service learning and research-based elements of our curriculum philosophy, because those two things are helping students develop tools and skills of science literacy, and then also leadership, collaboration, skills that are important and applicable beyond their academic careers. And then we can see I've incorporated the safe and healthy risk-taking element into our inquiry-based and research-based elements, because I want students to feel safe in taking the risk to ask questions or to share their own ideas and discoveries. And we can see that these 7 elements of our curriculum philosophy beget a myriad of benefits, both academically and emotionally. So academically, we see that these elements help to allow for deeper and more effective learning. Through outdoor or experiential learning, children are participating in what's known as whole child learning. So simultaneously, they are developing physically, cognitively, emotionally, socially, and intellectually. And of course, this experiential learning helps to spark interest, as does this discovery-based learning. And it allows them to hold an active role and take responsibility for their own learning process because they're learning to answer their own questions. Emotionally, we see that this curriculum philosophy helps to foster an emotional connection to the environment. giving students opportunities to empathize with nature and develop a sense of place. For sense of place, with our place-based element, of course, through outdoor learning, we are learning about our local surroundings. So we're learning about the biodiversity of New Jersey. And again, this helps students to develop their sense of place and form an emotional connection specifically to our local landscape and a desire to conserve it. And through their service learning and research opportunities, students can realize their own abilities to enact positive environmental change. So these benefits lead to impacts that, again, are far-reaching and valuable beyond students' academic career, and ultimately will lead them to become more informed citizens and future global leaders in the climate crisis. So now we can zoom out a little bit and take a look at our entire curriculum that we've built. So you can see the learning standards serve as the foundation for our curriculum. And then we can begin to fulfill children's cognitive and emotional needs in the context of climate education. So thinking back to those Sobel stages. And then we can use these philosophy elements to fulfill children's developmental needs, to empathize, explore, and participate in social action. And then finally, our philosophy elements also help us to deliver these botanical connections. So now we know what this philosophy looks like in theory. I want to share a little bit more about what it looks like in practice by sharing some example activities that are included in our curriculum. So for our youngest children in grades kindergarten through second, they are working on developing empathy and discovering the self. So a great way to do this is by incorporating sensory activities. So allowing them to engage with colors, shapes, scents, sounds to discover the world around them. And thinking back to that egocentric thinking and the recommendation to allow children to become instead of objectifying their learning material, we can see the incorporation of imaginative play and story-based movement. So for example, on the left, we see that children have their little ant antenna headbands on, and we were learning about ant communication, and they communicate with their feelers, their antennas. And then in the bottom photo, we see that we were learning about squirrels when it was fall. So we were going out and collecting acorns and then hiding them and burying them so we would have food to eat over the winter. And to children, this may just feel like playing pretend, but through these activities, we were actually helping them to learn about animal behavior and ecology. So taking a look at some of the activities that are featured in our curriculum, I love doing discovery tables. So again, engaging with the senses and then also using tools like magnifying glasses and scissors to further engage and investigate with the plant material. And then for second graders in our curriculum, we incorporate this glitter bees activity to help demonstrate pollination. So pollination is really hard to teach, especially for children this young, because it is not an observable process. So we have our glitter bees activity where children turn their finger into a bee by wrapping a pipe cleaner around it. And then we set up a whole garden of different colored paper flowers with different colored glitter in each of those flowers. And the children run around and have their little finger bees visit all the different flowers. And at the end, we take a look at their little bees' legs. And the glitter, the pollen has stuck to the bees' legs. And suddenly there's all different kinds of pollen from all different flowers stuck to this bee's legs, which serves as a great demonstration for pollination, which is normally not an observable process. For kids in upper elementary, grades 3 through 5, their instruction should be tailored towards allowing them to explore and discover the landscape. So some of the best things to incorporate for this age group include map making, nature journaling, and scavenger hunts. So for example, in our curriculum, we go on a scavenger hunt to look for all different kinds of weathering, to look for biological and mechanical weathering. And students will record their observations either through photos or creating an illustration in their nature journal. And then we have them think 100 years into the past and 100 years into the future, and take a snapshot from each of those time periods too, and draw a prediction about what they think will happen as this weathering continues on for 100 years into the future. In the photo on the bottom, we can see an example of how we can still bring in outdoor elements into our indoor classroom to allow for that same kind of nature connection and hands-on experiential learning. For middle schoolers, they're kind of in between this exploration and social action phase. They're not fully yet into the social action phase. So it's great to continue on with a nature journaling program for kids this age, and then also allowing them to contribute to student-led research, which should be focused on the local landscape. iNaturalist is also a great tool to kind of bridge this transition between exploration and social action. iNaturalist is a citizen science platform. It's an app, and there's also a desktop version. People kind of compare it to Pokemon Go. So you go out and you can take photographs of plants or any organism in the wild and upload it to an online database where other users can provide identifications for your observation. And once you have enough identifications that agree with each other, this observation is actually considered research quality and can be incorporated into real research publications. So again, this is a great way for students to actually contribute to positive social actions through simple exploration. So for middle schoolers, for examples of activities in our curriculum, we can take a look at one of our plant evolution activities that we do use iNaturalist for. But first, thinking back to teaching to those younger stages, we actually open up this plant evolution lesson with an empathy-based activity because it can be very hard for students to conceptualize this deep geologic timescale that evolution is happening on. We have the children make a timeline of the Earth's evolution on their own body. And we go through all the events of evolution, and we move that body part as we talk about those events. And then finally, when we get to the existence of humans, it's the very, very tip of our fingernail. So that really helps to put it in perspective, this evolutionary time. And after we've learned about these different evolutionary events and the plant groups that arose from them, we go outside and use iNaturalist to try to look for and observe these different evolutionary plant groups. So algae, mosses, ferns, conifers, and then flowering plants. And then they can use these observations and expand upon them further to compare their traits and think about the evolutionary landscape. And then for our high schoolers, they are fully in their social action phase. So again, it's great to still incorporate these citizen science elements like iNaturalist, and really stressing this ability to share your observations and how their observations are useful on a global scale. And this is also a great time to introduce more research participation in the local landscape, as well as community outreach projects. And students should not only be participants in these projects, they should be choosing the subject matter, planning it, delegating the tasks, and overseeing it as well, because this is what is going to help them build up those skills. And some example activities for high schoolers featured in our curriculum. Of course, we're still keeping up with that local landscape research, but again, the focus is on sharing the results. How are we going to communicate these results to our community? And we don't only have to connect with community through being outside and doing research or service learning projects. We can also use the internet to our advantage. So in our high school grades, we incorporate a social media campaign about an invasive or endangered species of New Jersey. And in the photos, you can see two infographics that I made in college, kind of as a little social media campaign for a class. And I really enjoyed this because it didn't feel like a class assignment. It felt like a real world problem of like, wow, how can I present this information in the best way? So in addition to lesson plans that are based on activities like the ones that we just went over, our botanical literacy curriculum digital document will also include lesson plans, or excuse me, will also include worksheets and activity packets, as well as supplemental resources with ideas for extension activities, field trips, and also resources for plant identification in case you don't feel confident having that background knowledge. And again, we expect this curriculum to be ready to be distributed and implemented by late fall, early summer of this year. So in addition to our botanical literacy curriculum helping to reduce plant blindness and promote an awareness and appreciation of plants, we'll also see long-term impacts. We'll be helping to support students' science literacy skills and also inspiring in them ways to connect botanical science beyond biology with applications and innovations for all different kinds of industries. And then through connecting and building empathy with nature, we'll also be helping them to instill a sense of environmental stewardship, which arguably is the most important ingredient in climate instruction. So in doing so, our botanical literacy curriculum will be helping to prepare New Jersey students as informed citizens and future global leaders ready to rise to the occasion of finding solutions for our climate crisis. Thank you everyone so much for watching my presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions now.
Great. Thank you, Eva. It looks like we have a couple comments in the chat. People really love jewel weeds, so they were very excited about that. We also have someone asking, stating that they've used Seek. Have you ever used Seek with the students instead of iNaturalist? Okay.
Yeah.
And then we have a couple questions. So Ryan's asking, is there a place in this curriculum for the arts in the upper grades? In the nonprofit world, we depend heavily on people with arts and other non-science skills.
I really like that question. That's a really good point. And I think that thinking about, again, for the upper grades, for high schoolers, that social action component, I think that environmental art is a great thing to incorporate. And before that question was asked, I didn't even consider the value of art projects, community art or environmental art to communicate to the greater community, to communicate positive environmental change. So I think that's a great point. And I think, oh, sorry, yeah, probably something, as we're still working on this, something to incorporate for the upper grades as well, to include not just communicating through research, but also more open-ended kind of activities.
Nice. So our next thing, let's see. Jeanette says, when you teach that plants support all life because of photosynthesis, when do you teach that plants support all life because of its photosynthesis, using carbon and releasing oxygen?
So the carbon cycle, yes, again, that's kind of a difficult process to demonstrate, not exactly observable. But in our curriculum, I think around second grade or third grade, we begin to do experiments that allow opportunities to directly observe photosynthesis. So we have one where we place plants underwater. We have aquatic plants underwater and we have them in sunlight. And then over time, you can see little bubbles begin to form on the leaf surfaces, and you can explain that is oxygen. You can actually see the plants releasing oxygen in real time.
That's great.
So, oh, sorry. Yeah. So I was just say for this age, that's great to use like experiments or other ways that they can directly observe this process.
So Kelly's asking, how are you finding the listings for the resources section? Do you need information from any of the surrounding nature centers?
We would definitely appreciate that. That would be great. So far in the development of the curriculum, we've really only been working on the lesson plans, and building up the supplemental resources is something that we were going to more start on this summer. So we would definitely appreciate any support that you could offer in that.
And as a follow-up, Maya asked, is there a way for us to submit organizations or centers to be included in your list?
But that would be great. Yeah, we would appreciate any outreach like that. I can put my email in the description. I realize I didn't include any contact info. So I'll put my email, and then feel free to reach out, and I will forward it to my supervisors as well. Okay, so I just put my contact info in the chat.
Looks like we have a few more minutes. Do we have any other questions from anyone out there?
I saw in the chat
instead of type.
Yeah. I did see in the chat some comments about the glitter bees activity, about using glitter, which is a good point. I definitely agree with that. And somebody else commented that they had used cheese doodles, and I saw that used as well. Used the powder from mac and cheese. I included the glitter because I felt it was easier to have different colors. But I guess too, the idea of flour, cornmeal, we have different colors, or maybe even dyeing flour somehow. So that's a note that I'll make to probably change for that lesson.
Erin, I'll throw in just a quick question here, Eva, for you. You had mentioned that the curriculum will be available in the summer of 2023, and I saw that it will be in a digital form. How is that? Do you have some sense how will that be distributed, or how will educators be able to access that curriculum once it's up and ready to go?
We still haven't done much of the planning for the implementation phase yet, but we do hope to incorporate some kind of forum to allow teachers to communicate with each other, and then also communicate with us at the DEP as they go through the process of implementing these lesson plans. So we don't want to just like hand this out, like, here you go, here's the digital file. We want to also be there to kind of walk them through and give them opportunities to share their experience teaching this curriculum.
I think a great opportunity for perhaps a workshop at our fall conference in end of September at Duke Farm. So keep that in mind. We would love to host something like this, and also to be the conduit to be able to kind of get this out to educators, and facilitate them getting a hold of it and cycling the feedback back to you folks.
That sounds great. That would be perfect.
All right, so I'm going to jump back in here. I see a couple more things coming through the chat. Three colored sugar sprinkles.
That's a good idea too.
You can put on your cookies too. So, but we've got about we're just about out of time here. It's about a little bit before 2 o'clock. But again, I really, on behalf of ANJEE, I want to thank our presenter Eva for all the work you put into this. It was really an amazing presentation. We really appreciate your time here today, and just express our gratitude for all the work you and your team are doing to bring this out to educators and teachers. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. For the group, I'll throw out a few reminders. At the end of the session, we're going to post an evaluation link, so you can be able to provide some feedback to Angie on the presentation. Don't forget, please subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can see any and all the presentations that you might not be able to get to live. I also throw out a quick piece for the in-person field experiences that are on Saturday and Sunday. It's not too late to go back if your schedule opened up or suddenly you've watched the weather and you're looking for something to do. Get back in there, sign up for a field trip. There's a lot of great choices, but yeah, we have until about 4 o'clock today to do so. So don't think too long. Don't think, just act. Get in there, sign up for those in-person field trips. They're going to be a lot of great experiences. Again, just thanks to our conference sponsors, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, our anonymous donor, and also thanks to the Institute for Natural History Arts. And it is 2 o'clock. So those of you who are going to the 2:30, we'll see you there. And again, on behalf of Angie and our board and staff, thank you, everyone. And we look forward to seeing everybody at future workshops. And that's all we have. All right. Thank you all. Everybody have a great day.